Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Noreen Humble, and I'm the Acting Director of the Calgary Institute for the Humanities at the University of Calgary. We are broadcasting this evening from Calgary, which is located on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region C3. The University of Calgary is situated on land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River. The traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mohkinstsis, which we now call the city of Calgary. I would also like to acknowledge the diverse traditional territories of those of you joining this broadcast from outside Calgary, wherever you share in the bounty of Turtle Island. Thank you for joining us this evening for the Calgary Institute for the Humanities' second annual LGBTQ2S+ lecture, which is being broadcast in conjunction with the 30th anniversary of Calgary Pride and in partnership with the Journal of the History of Sexuality and UCalgary alumni. We are proud to be one of the more than 25 virtual programs being held throughout September for Alumni Month. The passion of our alumni, their vision and involvement in the community here and around the world elevate UCalgary's reputation as a global leader and changemaker. And I encourage you all to check out the entire Alumni Month schedule at alumni.ucalgary.ca/alumni-month. The CIH is the oldest humanities institute in Canada and has a long history of civic engagement and hosting events which bring groundbreaking scholars and scholarship into conversation with the broader community. The establishment of an annual LGBTQ2S+ lecture is the brainchild of Jim Ellis, who after 5 years at the helm of the Institute is currently on a well-deserved year-long sabbatical. As the recent LGBTQ2S+ history map produced last year by the CIH's Calgary Atlas Project shows, the University of Calgary has for decades been a prominent advocate and voice for the LGBTQ community. And our goal at the CIH is to build an endowment to sustain this annual lecture as a high-profile event, which will continue to demonstrate the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion. It is an uneasy time in world affairs, with far too many examples of these values coming under threat. So it has never been more important to stand up and affirm them, to build strong communities embracing everyone, particularly the LGBTQ2S+ and BIPOC communities, and to decry marginalization of any sort. Our speaker this evening is Professor Lillian Faderman, a true pioneer and leader in the field of lesbian history. Her talk, The Rise and Fall of Lesbian Nation, will be moderated by Professor Annette Tim from the University of Calgary's History Department, who serves as the current editor of the Journal of the History of Sexuality and has helped to curate this lecture series from its inception. There will be a Q&A session after the lecture, and you could submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. That then opens a window wherein you can type your question. We appreciate all your questions very much, but please note that owing to our limited time, we may not be able to answer all of them. But first, to provide some words of welcome from the community, I am very pleased to turn you over to Kevin Allen, who himself has worked tirelessly to bring to light and preserve stories of the history of Calgary's LGBTQ+ community. Do check out his book, Our Past Matters, Stories of Gay Calgary, and his website, the Calgary Gay History Project.
Thanks, Noreen, and welcome everyone who's attending. Virtually, we can't see you, but we can feel you out there. I'm a proud U of C alumnus, as well as a proud Calgarian. And I just wanted to give some context to tonight's lecture with regards to the university and with regards to lesbian feminism in Calgary. So the University of Calgary has a very interesting history when it comes to the LGBTQ2 community. Far back as 1969, the Students' Union at the U of C invited Hal Call, who's one of the Mattachines, to a public lecture that was sold out. It was a packed room. And this is before homosexuality was decriminalized in Canada. So it was very groundbreaking. University of Calgary students formed an early chapter of the Gay Liberation Front, which was a movement that came out of New York and out of Stonewall. And we had our first chapter here in 1972. It wasn't very long-lived, but it was connected to the university. And one of the people that I interviewed who was founder of that, her name is Myra Lipton. She self-described herself as a radical lesbian feminist in those early days. And then a year later, Sir John Wolfenden, who was instrumental in getting homosexuality decriminalized in the UK, came as a distinguished guest lecturer in 1973. So throughout U of C's history, we have that interesting queer narrative emerging. I want to just add a little bit about lesbian feminism in Calgary. Calgary, like so many other places in North America, had a real blossoming of lesbians and their activism in the 70s and 80s. Lesbians were at the helm at a lot of our leading feminist organizations in the city. And by the time the 80s rolled around, we had lesbian-run lesbian organizations in the city, such as the Lesbian Mothers Defense Fund, which were dealing with issues of child custody with lesbian mothers, and Lesbian Information Lines, which was our peer support line. Gay men and lesbians sort of diverged in the 80s, like they did in many places, and had their own spaces, women-only spaces, gay male-only spaces. And I want to note a particular woman who I've interviewed, Dr. Ruth Simpkin. She was a medical doctor here who was really instrumental in organizing lesbian community. She was a big fan and a regular attendee and volunteer at the Michigan Women's Festival. And she also organized bursaries for women to go to the women's music festivals across North America. So making sure it was accessible for people. So the lesbians in Calgary were networked to lesbians all around North America. And then finally, I just want to, I'm so excited to hear this lecture. I'm a big fan of Dr. Faderman's. I've read a lot of queer history books, gay history books, and some of them can be quite dry, but Dr. Faderman makes for a really engaging read, and they're very accessible and page turning. And Dr. Faderman has done a lot of oral history interviews like I've done, as our history is not so necessarily well kept in archives and libraries. And so Dr. Faderman's work is really important to preserve our history, those sort of groundbreaking oral history interviews that have been done. So I'm a big fan. See, I've got my copy of the Gay Revolution right here, and I'm going to pass it on now to Dr. Annette Tim to do the introduction.
Hello. It is my very great pleasure and not a small challenge to introduce Dr. Lillian Faderman to you. It is a pleasure because when I was thinking about who the second speaker in the CIH's LGBTQ2S+ lecture series should be, Dr. Faderman was at the very top of my list. I could think of no other historian who has so revolutionized the field of LGBT history and particularly lesbian history. But this introduction is also a challenge because the list of Dr. Faderman's accomplishments is very long. I'll just hit a few highlights. You might have noticed that I called her an historian, and she definitely is, but she is also a professor of Emerita of English at California State University, Fresno, having retired in 2007. Having now read her fascinating and entertaining 2003 memoir, Naked in the Promised Land, I think I understand a bit better how she managed to combine the disciplines of English and history in one career. She seems to have drawn power from a tumultuous childhood and a complex relationship with her mother to turn herself into a master of adaptation and innovation. Lillian's mother, Mary, and her Aunt Ray lost their entire Latvian family in the Holocaust, and they never stopped suffering from regrets about failing to bring them to the United States. The two sisters never found out the details about what had happened to their family members. Growing up with a story so marked by missing information perhaps provided Lillian with an insight that few historians have. She saw that missing information is not just a roadblock, but a call to methodological innovation. Lillian combines her personal insight with the skills of an English professor. She reads texts deeply and with an eye to their undertones of intimacy and emotion. Her work is unfailingly empathetic, a fact that I now see as a result of her family history, and how she came to terms with it. As a university student at Berkeley and UCLA, Lillian thought of her mother as, quote, a broken record of suffering. But even before she published a family memoir, My Mother's Wars, in 2013, Lillian realized that Mary, the poor garment worker, single mother, and immigrant, was actually a hero. The ability to see the heroic in the tragic and mundane, to find deep humanity and love relationships that others cannot understand, perhaps explains how Dr. Faderman became one of the founders of lesbian history. She knew to look in places others had not: private letters, poetry, even pornography. Her path-breaking 1981 book, Surpassing the Love of Men, Romantic Friendship and Love Between Women from the Renaissance to the Present, draws on every possible snippet of information to find stories about women who loved women, stories that were actually even more challenging to find than those about men who loved men, since lifelong female friendship and even cohabitation raised far fewer eyebrows. That there were often no laws against these relationships meant that there were no court records for later historians to find. Finding the traces of lesbian life in the past therefore took focus and practiced eyes. The eyes of someone who had herself lived an interesting and often secretive life. And Lillian's life has definitely been interesting. I can only recommend her memoirs to you. They're fascinating and entertaining. You'll find stories of a circuitous coming out and an unconventional path to academic life, a path that had her at times working as a pinup girl and a burlesque dancer. I mention this only because I think it has bearing on what makes her historical work so compelling. It perhaps explains the incredible warmth and understanding, the unwillingness to pigeonhole that she brings to her stories about the lives of those who defy easy categorization. Most recently, Lillian's 2005 book, The Gay Revolution, The Story of the Struggle, and her 2018 biography of the San Francisco politician and gay activist, Harvey Milk, demonstrated that her empathy extends to all LGBT people. And she insists that the courage it takes to come out is what brought about lasting social change for all. These books have garnered a whole list of awards, some of which were listed on the PowerPoint that you saw scrolling at the beginning of our presentation, so I won't list them all. I will just say that they get mentioned not just in academia, but also from newspapers of record, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Guardian. But perhaps the most important praise of all comes from the readers Lillian was most focused on reaching. She is rarely introduced without a story about how her books have personally affected her readers. I'll give you just one example. At a 2018 book talk at the Jewish Community Center in San Francisco, the moderator, Michelle T., said that she had been immediately drawn to Lillian's 1991 book, Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers. Michelle said, I didn't realize how badly I needed that book to give me a historical context for myself and to understand who my ancestors were. It is a rare historical book that is described with the word need, and Lillian has written or edited 11 of them. We are now very privileged to hear a bit about what Lillian has been up to lately, and we can all be grateful that her retirement has been an extremely active one. Please welcome Dr. Lillian Faderman.
I think I was just unmuted by the host, so I said that was a beautiful introduction. Annette, thank you so much. And I said I will try to live up to it, and that's a challenge. So lesbian feminism began as a movement in 1970, and it was still going strong in the 1980s and even into the early 1990s. And now it's very widely regarded by the LGBT community as essentialist and as a product of less enlightened and transphobic times. So I will address that issue, but first I want to talk about why it appeared when it did and what it hoped to accomplish and what it did actually accomplish and why it eventually failed. And Sean, can we have the first slide, please? Sean, are you with me? Thank you. So first, I'm going to go back to the 1950s when I came out as a gay girl into the lesbian bar culture as a teenager. If the straight world thought about homosexuals at all in the 1950s, it was always as sickos or sinners or criminals. There were tiny homophile organizations. There was the Mattachine Society, for instance, which was mostly for gay men. There was the Daughters of Bilitis, which was mostly for lesbians, but they were very small, and most gay people never heard of those organizations. The only popular acknowledgement of lesbians could be found on drugstore paperback book racks, and I devoured them as a teenager. I read them because it was the only place where you could read about love between women. But as you could see from these covers, they were sensationalistic. And of course, they always had to end badly with one of the women committing suicide or converting to heterosexuality or drowning in a well of loneliness. But the 1960s came along and it saw multiple social revolutions. First of all, the Black Revolution, and then Latinos and Native Americans, and the anti-war movement, and then the second wave of feminism, beginning with the publication in 1963 of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique. And then at the very end of the decade, just like a few months before the end, in June 1969, the Stonewall riots, which finally put gay in the newspapers, and it was no longer the love that dared not speak its name. So the first gay organization to form a few weeks after the riots in the summer of '69 was the New York Gay Liberation Front. And it was made up of young people who were in the New Left. They had fought on the front lines of the anti-war protests. They supported the revolutions of Blacks and other minorities. And they brought radical politics into the new gay movement. They also knew how to have a great time. May we have the next slide, please, Sean? So they had in the Gay Liberation Front these wonderful dances. Gay people no longer had to go to these mafia bars. There was just a lot of energy in the GLF, but it was primarily this, as you can see from this terrific photo, it was male sexual energy. It was really about male sexual liberation. There were only about 10% of the membership in GLF were women. Most of the women who had been in the Gay Liberation Front had been radical feminists before, and they felt uncomfortable with the male focus of GLF. But for the first 6 months, they just hadn't put together the ideas of the two movements that had recently cropped up, the gay liberation movement on the one hand and the women's liberation movement on the other hand, until in January 1970, when Rita Mae Brown showed up at a Gay Liberation Front meeting. May we have the next slide, please, Sean? And that's Rita Mae Brown. She'd been a member of the Student Homophile League at Columbia University, but she dropped out of that, she said, because most of the members were men, and as she said, quote, they didn't give a damn about the needs of women. And then she joined Betty Friedan's organization, the National Organization for Women, which started in 1967. But she dropped out of that, she said, because they were interested in issues that were important, like job discrimination and abortion, but they weren't at all interested in the particular problems of lesbians. Then she joined a radical socialist women's group, Red Stockings, but they were interested in issues such as the rights of prostitutes and childcare for working mothers. Again, very important issues, but lesbians were never mentioned there either. And so she showed up at a meeting of the Gay Liberation Front, She was charismatic and passionate speaker, and she played the Pied Piper to whatever lesbians there were at the meeting. She told them, first of all, that Stonewall was a gay man's revolution. And for lesbians, she said, it, quote, wasn't all that significant because lesbian oppression and gay male oppression have less in common than you think. She told them that lesbians' real problems began with the fact that they were women in a patriarchal world, and that that's what they had to fight. And she said gay men had no interest in helping them with that fight. So she invited the lesbians in the Gay Liberation Front to form an all-lesbian group with her. And it worked. About 20 GLF women went off with Rita Mae Brown. They eventually called their group the Radical Lesbians. Just about this time, Betty Friedan, remember she had founded the National Organization for Women. She was getting upset that people hostile to feminism were saying that the women's movement was dominated by lesbians and that normal women didn't want or need feminism. Of course, there were a lot of lesbians in NOW, and there were certainly a lot of lesbians in the leadership of NOW, and that made Betty Friedan very nervous. And so in an article in the New York Times, she was quoted as complaining that lesbians had infiltrated her organization and they were the, quote, lavender menace of the women's movement. Well, Friedan's comments about the lavender menace became a clarion call to Rita Mae Brown and the radical lesbians, and they decided to write a manifesto that would argue that patriarchy is the reason for all women's problems, and women encourage patriarchy by heterosexuality, and lesbianism is the answer to solve the problems of patriarchy. Together, and they just had this evangelical fervor. So they wrote this manifesto called the Woman Identified Woman, and it became, for a while at least, a classic among lesbians and among many feminists as well. It argued that lesbians were just like any woman, only more so. The opening line of the manifesto was, quote, a lesbian is the rage of all women condensed to the point of explosion. And it presented lesbians as the true vanguard of the feminist movement. It argued that straight women needed to take lesbians as their role models. They needed to stop being male identified and become woman identified. And that meant especially that they needed to stop denying one another love, even sexual love, the love that they gave to men. The manifesto declared, quote, our energies must flow toward our sisters and not backwards towards our oppressors. The point was that any woman could become a lesbian, and that if she was a true feminist, that's what she would choose to be. And they found a perfect place to deliver their manifesto to the world. May we have the next slide, please, Sean? So Betty Friedan's National Organization for Women was putting on a women's conference on May 1st, 1970, and not a single lesbian speaker had been invited to the conference. Rita Mae Brown and the radical lesbians decided that, as they said, they would kidnap the conference. They had an artist design Lavender Menace t-shirts, which these three are wearing just to thumb their nose at Betty Friedan. The evening of the conference, several hundred women were gathered in the auditorium waiting for a panel to begin, and the radical lesbians got control of the lights. They switched all the lights off. They plastered signs on the auditorium walls while the lights were switched off that said things like, Super Dyke loves you, and the woman's movement is a lesbian plot, like the signs these three are holding. And then about 20 of them ran up to the front of the auditorium, and for the next hours, they regaled the audience with the arguments that they had developed in their Women Identified Women essay. And astonishingly, most of the audience stayed to listen because I think they had really struck a chord among feminist women. News of the radical lesbian zap got major attention in the burgeoning feminist press, and that was really the start of the radical lesbian feminist movement. Rita Mae Brown was also behind the next big development in radical lesbian feminism. So the following year, 1971, she moved to Washington, D.C. to find out how national politics worked, because she had these very grand ideas. As she wrote, quote, "The most important thing for the movement is to take over the power of the state. That is the only challenge worth meeting. Anything else is a retreat from that responsibility." And she had a particularly grandiose idea of forming a woman's party. Now, the idea of the woman's party isn't new. Alice Paul actually formed a woman's party in 1916 to agitate for women's suffrage. But Rita Mae Brown wanted to make that party really important in United States politics. She hoped that the Women's Party would vote men out of power and vote women into power. And as the first step, she met a dozen other radical lesbians in Washington, D.C., and they decided that they would form a collective, which would operate like a Bolshevik cell. They would live together or in a couple of connected houses. They would all share the chores. They would keep their clothes in a common room, and all the clothes would belong to everyone equally. They would sleep together in one big room in a mattress on the floor. I don't think any of them were over 25, and so it was very exciting and doable to them. And to be independent of men, they said, they would learn the skills that men had hogged from it themselves. They would learn car repair, for instance, or house repair. They would learn self-defense. Most of them had to have outside jobs to pay the bills, of course, but their real work would be to find ways to rid the world of patriarchy and to remake society to, as they said, be non-sexist and non-racist and non-imperialist and socialist, and to tell women everywhere who the group was and what they were doing. And to do that, they put out a newspaper. The newspaper was called The Furies, and they printed The Furies in the basement of one of the collective houses. May we have the next slide, please, Sean? So this is a copy of an issue of The Furies. They call their collective The Furies also, and obviously it was named after the Greek myth, the three Greek goddesses with blood red eyes and snakes for hair, who took vengeance on Orestes because he killed his mother, and so they drove him crazy. And inspired by the original Furies, the Furies newspaper and the Furies collective vowed that they would, as they said, avenge the Chinese women whose feet were bound, the Ibibo women whose clitorises were cut off, and every woman who had ever been physically and economically and psychologically raped. They would do it, they promised, by building a movement that would, quote, effectively stop the violent, sick, oppressive acts of male supremacy. But they emphasized that movement that they were building had to be not just a feminist movement, it had to be a lesbian feminist movement. Women's liberation itself, they said, can't fight male supremacy. And that's because women's liberation doesn't grapple with the main problem. Only as lesbians could women escape from male domination, because lesbians undermined the power that men exercised over women. May we have the next slide, please, Sean? So what they meant by lesbian was not simply a sexual orientation or a bedroom act, but a conscious political choice. Lesbians are not born, the Furies said. Lesbians are women who have chosen to refuse to put themselves at the service of men. to do the newspaper, the Furies, they had to teach themselves everything. And I think it was really quite astonishing. These were women who knew nothing about producing a newspaper. So they had to learn how to do newspaper production and distribution. They had to do layout, and they had to print the newspaper, and they had to assemble it, and they had to get subscribers, and they had to get stores to carry it. They had to figure out how to best mail it. May we have the next slide, Sean? May we have the next slide, Sean? Thank you. So what they meant, I'm sorry, so the Furies collective, the women who lived together in houses, lasted no more than a year or so. And I discovered very sadly, and I think it was true of many of the collectives that developed, they were torn apart by violent arguments about how best to build utopia. So the Furies collective didn't last long, but the Furies newspaper did last several years. It lasted until June 1973, and it was sold at women's bookstores that were beginning to mushroom up all across America. It eventually inspired thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands probably, of lesbian feminists to form their own collectives in cities and farms and forests and mountains all over America and in Europe too. The Furies also inspired scores of other lesbian feminist newspapers and magazines. The names of these newspapers and magazines were so creative, I think, and they often proclaimed with in-your-face defiance what they were about. May we have the next slide, Sean, please? So this one is Tribid, a lesbian separatist news journal. And you see that they're carrying battle axes like the Amazons. And you can see in the fine print that it was to be sold to, and it was going to be shared only with lesbians. May we have the next slide, please? And this one is Pearl Diver. This is a picture of the Michigan Women's Music Festival. The name Pearl Diver, of course, was obviously defiant. It describes something of a lesbian sexual act. There were also other defiant names of these magazines and newspapers. There were Dykes and Gorgons and Amazon and Purple Rage and so on and so forth. All of the radical lesbian feminist newspapers and magazines said that any woman can choose to be a lesbian. And if you're truly committed to feminism, that's the choice that you'll make. I think there were probably more lesbians in America in the 1970s than at any time in history, and probably at any time since then. Unlike the lesbians who joined the homophile organizations in the 1950s and the 60s, the new lesbians, the radicals, didn't want a place at the table. They really aimed to trash the whole dining room. They wanted to form what one writer, a lesbian writer, Jill Johnston, called Lesbian Nation, which was the name of her popular book that she published in 1973. May we have that one, Sean? Thank you. So Lesbian Nation, the feminist solution, she called it. In her book, Johnston further promoted the idea that radical lesbian feminism could shape a woman's culture with all of the best values that weren't male. It would be non-hierarchical. It would be non-exploitative. It would even be non-monogamous, because monogamy meant that someone owned someone else. To do that, Johnston suggested women would have to separate from all men. They would have to become lesbian separatists. And in her book, Johnston created an image of a lesbian bus that would go around picking up lesbians from far-flung places all over the country and bring them together into a separate woman's world. And that image of the lesbian bus became emblematic. It even inspired songs like Sweet Betsy the Dyke. And this is my partner of 48 years, Phyllis Irwin, and we're gonna sing Sweet Betsy the Dyke together. Oh, do you remember Sweet Betsy the Dyke, who came from New Jersey on her motorbike, and riding beside her was her lover Ann, a sister, a friend, and a far-out woman. Singing dykes come together, we can change this land. Singing dykes come together, we can change this land. They rode across the country, Sweet Betsy and Ann, and said to all women, you know that you can. So leave all your menfolk and come on with us. If you don't have a cycle, we'll charter a bus. Thank you. May we have the next slide, please. The real revolution of society, lesbian feminists insisted, was dependent on women getting together as lesbians and as lovers. And you could see this sign, the revolution is just a kiss away. The big idea was that instead of spending energy on the impossible task of trying to fix the men and their man-made world, lesbian feminists would make an all-woman's world apart from men. Their world would have absolutely no men in it. Neither straight men nor gay men, wouldn't even have straight women in it. They were inspired by the Nation of Islam's Black separatist movement in the 1960s, which meant Black people living in self-sufficiency, cutting the white devil, as Nation of Islam called white people, cutting the white devil out of their lives altogether. They were also inspired by the Back to the Land hippie movement of the 1960s. The Back to the Land idea fit very well with their vision because lesbian feminists saw nature as Mother Earth, into whose beautiful bosom they would escape from the iniquitous struggle to get a bigger piece of the rotten pie in a man-made patriarchal world. They had ideas about bringing back the ancient world of the matriarchy with its worship of the great goddess. And they, lesbian separatists established country communes all over the country, in California, in Oregon, New Mexico, Arizona, upstate New York, Massachusetts, Vermont, and also in places like Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota and Missouri, and even in the South, in Arkansas and Louisiana and Florida and Tennessee and Mississippi. And their motto was, our feet on the ground, our heads in the clouds, our hands on each other. May we have the next slide, please, Sean? And so if you're going to live on a commune, of course, you have to be self-sufficient by planting your own food. But these were city women. I'm sorry for the quality of the slide, but maybe in the background you could see that one of the women is reading a book. She's reading a book on gardening. It's a how-to book, and she's instructing the other women on how to plant vegetables. May we have the next slide, Sean? And so here they're making their lesbian garden. I think the slide is really touching because they're kind of at a loss. I mean, it's just such a, their expressions, what you could see of at least one of them is kind of quizzical and they don't know quite what to do yet. May we have the next slide, Sean? And so they're designing a garden here, a cunt garden, they call it, in the shape of female genitalia with red cabbage and summer squash and cantaloupe and so on. May we have the next slide, Sean? And they really admired witches and saw themselves as the heirs of witches. And here they're dancing by the light of the moon, and there are cats as is appropriate for witches. May we have the next slide, Sean? They were very into astrology, so everyone's horoscope in this particular commune was put up on the wall. May we have the next slide? I love this little drawing of activities around the commune. So some women are working very hard, splitting wood and stacking wood, but they're being entertained by a woman playing her guitar. And you can see a woman in the distance swinging on a swing from a tree. And of course, it's interracial. And you can see an interracial couple in the house upstairs making love. And this was just this idyllic vision of what life would be like on a commune. May we have the next slide, please? And this is a carpenter's workshop. They're learning, these women are, again, I want to emphasize, most of them were city women. They knew nothing about this stuff. They're learning from scratch how to build a house. May we have the next slide, please? And again, their magazine. This was May's, a country magazine. This particular issue had instructions on how to build things, how to make your own house, and how to make your own furniture. May we have the next slide, please? And here they're building a hexagon. The hexagon, of course, was a very important symbol in witchcraft. May we have the next slide? And I think this is a good example of how devoted they were to non-monogamy. So couples were out and 3 women are holding hands. They were a threesome, not a couple. And may we have the next slide, please? And they were very into nudity, that is bathing in the sun, and not at all concerned about peering men's eyes, because it was an all woman's society. May we have the final slide of this, please? And here they're doing Tai Chi, not only for strength, but for self-defense as well. Not all of the lesbian feminist communes were rural, like the first commune, the Furies. Some were in cities, but the most important thing always the lesbian feminists said was that lesbians cut men out of their lives in every way they could, and that they could come home to each other. May we have the next slide, Sean? Thank you. A little cartoon that appeared in one of the lesbian feminist newspapers set in some future time when lesbian feminists speak to the spirit of the wise woman who teaches them about the wisdom of the natural world. So they're asking the wise woman how women learned this ancient wisdom, how to be separated from men. And the wise woman says that it's because we stop being so arrogant, and we look to nature. And of course, it's whales and elephants who go around in all female pods. So they were very invested in that idea. Urban separatist groups pooled their money and their energies, and they lived together, usually in a house or adjoining apartments. They tried to create lesbian worlds, even though they were surrounded by reminders of the patriarchy, as they said. For instance, I interviewed a number of women in Washington State who had been urban lesbian separatists. I interviewed them for, I believe, my book, The Gay Revolution, which came out in 2015. So I probably interviewed them about 2012, 2013. And they told me that in Seattle, like other cities of some size, they had several lesbian separatist communities. The Gorgons were the strict separatists. Not even young boys or lesbians who had anything to do with men or straight women were allowed to darken the door of the Gorgons, they said. There was a group called the Separatist Gang. They weren't as hardcore as Gorgons, but their name itself was a pretty clear don't mess with us message. May we have the next slide, please, Sean? As part of this don't mess with us threat, they refused to adhere to male notions of beauty, and many radical lesbian feminists even grew beards, as these women do. In nearby Olympia, I was told by the women I interviewed, there were another half dozen hardcore separatist houses, such as Emma Goldman Collective and a group called Revolting Women. And there was a Raging Women, another group. And then there were some that were less ferociously militant, I was told. A group called Nanny Noodles, and there was the Millett House, named after Kate Millett, the author of the classic feminist book, Sexual Politics. There was the Gold Flower Brigade, which got its name from a group of women in the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So lesbian separatists in cities really tried very hard to find ways to be self-sufficient. For instance, they developed food co-ops. There was one, for example, in New York called the New York Lesbian Food Conspiracy, where food was sold at cost. In other cities, they opened garages with all women car mechanics. May we have the next slide, please, Sean? And they learned, I have to again emphasize that, again, they learned this stuff from scratch. In their generation, it wasn't like in high school, you could take auto mechanics or you could take shop. They had to teach themselves how to do this stuff. Can we have the next slide, Sean, please? So they learned how to handle tools. And then they also developed various services for one another that made it possible to live in cities. That's okay, let's go to that slide. Sean, thank you. Made it possible to live in cities without being dependent on men. So in this slide, they were very concerned about healthcare needs in those days when only about 10% of all the doctors were women. And so they're learning how to do a cervical exam in this slide. They created a unique culture and they called it a woman's culture. Sometimes they spelled it W-O-M-Y-N, sometimes W-O-M-M-I-N, sometimes W-O-M-B-I-N, always to avoid the root man. But their woman's culture was actually a lesbian feminist culture. And they didn't call it a woman's culture to be euphemistic. They weren't at all ashamed of the word lesbian, and they loved the word dyke. But for them, lesbian culture and woman's culture were synonymous. Woman's culture, that is lesbian culture, lesbian feminist culture, was intended to have all of the nurturing, loving values that lesbian feminists, they were very essentialist, that lesbian feminists associated with women. May we have the next slide, please, Sean? This is a page that I got out of a lesbian feminist newspaper, this one from Los Angeles. What I wanted to point out here was just all of the services that were available within the lesbian feminist community. There were several bookstores, there was a woman's clinic, there was a tour agency for women only called Women Tours. There were women painters to paint your house or apartments. There was a lesbian feminist resort. There was music intended just for lesbians and lesbian feminists, women's music, they called it. And among the first, some of the first to develop this woman's culture were women who were part of the Furies collective. After the Furies broke up, they went on to start some really remarkable projects. For example, Coletta Reed founded Diana Press, one of the first lesbian feminist publishing houses, which then made all of these lesbian feminist women's bookstores possible. And Helene Harris and Lee Schwing went on to start Women in Distribution, which was the main distributor for all of the many women's book publishers that were cropping up during the 1970s and the 1980s, and supplying all of these women's bookstores. I discovered that eventually in the 1970s and the 1980s, there were over 140 women's bookstores just all over the country, in big cities all over America. May we have the next slide, please, Sean? So this is an example of one, and you can see many of them, like Mama Bears, this is in Oakland, California, they weren't just bookstores, they were also coffee houses and art galleries. This one was a little less separatist than many of them were, because they sold books by gay men also, but they really reached out to all aspects of the community. Women's spirituality and addiction, recovery, and third world women, which in those days was the preferred term for people of color, and women in business and pregnancy and parenting and so on and so forth. A new lesbian feminist literature developed overnight to appeal to these new readers who were going to these women's bookstores, and they were sold in these new women's bookstores. And radical lesbian feminists also created an audience for women's music, which grew into a big business, not necessarily financially, but it provided the soundtrack for hundreds of thousands of lesbians' lives during the 1970s and 80s and even into the 1990s. And again, it was the women who had been part of this Furies collective that paved the way. May we have the next slide, please, Sean? So these are some of the early Olivia Records women, including Jenny Beerson and Jennifer Woodhull, who were part of the Furies collective. And Olivia Records was a pioneer in popularizing a whole new genre of women's music. Just as a footnote, Olivia has now turned into a wonderful cruise agency, but it appeals not to radical lesbian feminists anymore, because these cruises all around the world, Olivia cruises, are quite wonderful, but you can't be poor and radical and living on a commune to afford to go to them. But in those days, the audience that Olivia built made these huge, massive women's music festivals possible. They were women-only retreats that brought thousands of bare-breasted Amazons to forests and mountains, to states such as Michigan and Nebraska and Georgia and Pennsylvania, and we even had one in California. May we have the next slide, please? So this is a slide of the Michigan Women's Music Festival that you saw in a drawing earlier. The festivals went on for 40 years. They fell out of favor with a large part of what has come to be called the LGBTQ community. And the most popular festival, the Michigan Women's Music Festival, at its height, it had about 10,000 attendees. The last festival for Michigan was in 2015. That was their final festival. They went out of business, I think, for a number of reasons. Mostly, I think it was because lesbian feminists were dying off. A new generation of women who were lesbians and also considered themselves feminism. The feminists resented that all of the political orthodoxies that they saw in lesbian feminists. The younger generation, beginning in the mid-1990s, really wanted more place for individuality. They were less interested in collectivity. They did recognize, I think, that as feminists, they had some common concerns with the earlier generation of lesbian feminists, but they rejected what they saw as the essentialism of lesbian feminist womanhood. They thought the concept of woman should be anything that an individual wanted it to be. And they became the third wave of the feminist movement. More controversial, I think, was that lesbian feminists and also their music festivals fell out of favor with the new generation because many lesbian feminists insisted that a woman is someone with female genitalia, which of course excluded trans women. Even the most mainstream and conservative of the older gay rights organizations now, I'm thinking of organizations such as the HRC, with the Human Rights Campaign, even organizations like the HRC and the Lesbian National Lesbian Rights Organization joined the reaction against woman-born, woman-only spaces. They were boycotting the festivals, I think, because of the perceived exclusion of trans women. So the revolution that radical lesbian feminists dreamed of never came, and the separatist fever broke, and lesbian feminism virtually disappeared, at least for younger generations. And I think it happened for a number of reasons. One reason was that feminism really did succeed in opening more opportunities for women and in promoting something like gender equality. And so women began to have fewer gripes with what had been called the patriarchy. And then also, some of the women who had become lesbians to escape the patriarchy then escaped lesbian nation, and some of them even returned to heterosexuality. I want to give you what I think is a very interesting example, a very good case in point because of the trajectory of this story, and that's Chirlane McCrae. Chirlane McCrae was an African-American woman who'd been a junior at Wellesley College in 1974 when the Black lesbian feminist Combahee River Collective was formed. And she joined, and along with Audre Lorde and Gloria Hull and Barbara Smith, some of the most important figures in the Black lesbian feminist movement, she helped to write the group's manifesto, the very important Combahee River Collective Statement. And its sentiments, one way in which it was certainly different from white-dominated lesbian feminism was that it recognized that Black women also had to make coalition with sympathetic Black men. But its sentiments in other ways were very consistent with most radical lesbian feminist thought of the era. For instance, the statement called for, quote, the destruction of the political economic system of capitalism, imperialism, and patriarchy. In 1979, Chirlane McCrae wrote an article for Essence, which was a mass circulation magazine for young Black women. The article was absolutely groundbreaking. It was the first one ever written for a Black magazine by an openly Black lesbian. The title just boldly stated, I am a lesbian. And in the piece itself, McCrae called herself, quote, fortunate because I discovered my preference for women early before getting locked in traditional marriage and having children. Well, McCrae later went on to become a speechwriter for New York's first African-American mayor, David Dinkins. And in 1991, she fell in love with Dinkins' aide, who was a progressive. The person had been a very avid supporter of the communist Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and that aide was Bill de Blasio, and they married 3 years later. In 2013, as I'm sure many of you know, Bill de Blasio was elected mayor of New York, and Chirlane McCrae became the First Lady of New York. But what was left of her radical lesbian feminist days, and what was left is very important, I think. She and her husband became strong supporters of LGBTQ civil rights. They were especially supportive of New York's same-sex marriage bill, which passed in 2011, thanks to her energy and Bill de Blasio's energy and other activists in New York. But 2011 was well before it passed in other states. Other lesbian feminist stalwarts in the 1970s, of the 1970s, remained lesbians, though they didn't, many of them remain separatists. I interviewed a number of women who had been lesbian separatists in the 70s and 80s who are still living in Florida. Corky Culver told me that she lived on a commune called North 40, which was outside of Gainesville, Florida. She said 40 acres of lesbian land dotted with pine trees and oaks, an Amazon utopia, she called it. She had been a new PhD when she came to North 40, but she didn't want an academic career. She thought that that meant that she would have to compromise with the patriarchy. She wanted, as she said, to quote, live off the grid and out of the patriarchy. So the lesbian separatists who lived on North 40 dug wells, and they built jerry-rigged houses with renegade plumbing. They danced naked in the full moon, she said, and they sang lesbian songs to promote harmony. But she said, as she and the other women aged, the Amazon life seemed less attractive, and her anxieties for the future caused her to check on how much money she'd get from Social Security when she was too old to grow sprouts for a living or have a little jam factory on the property, which was the way they'd been supporting themselves. And she found that she just hadn't worked enough quarters at jobs that would qualify her for a monthly check from the government when she was old. And she said that none of the women at the North 40 had. And so as they got older, they all left. And she said they, quote, ended up getting jobs, credit cards, health insurance, wanting central heating and air conditioning. So what did it all mean? And did they accomplish anything? Some of the women who'd lived on radical lesbian feminist communes told me that they came to regard that time of their life as, quote, cocooning in a secure hideaway, but only until they were ready to sprout wings. I interviewed a woman, again, in Washington State by the name of Anne Schleck. She said she arrived in Olympia in 1976, backpack slung over one shoulder, guitar slung over the other, an 18-year-old hippie from Madison, Wisconsin, and she came to Gold Flower Brigade. That was her safe haven, she told me. She worked on and off as a carpenter. She helped out at the Northwest Women's Music Festival. She edited Matrix, which was a radical lesbian newsletter. The charm of the lesbian ghetto for her had been that it protected her and the other women from the patriarchy outside. But as she and others came to realize it also, as she said, it walled them in. She said they came to feel it was just a bad gamble living in a marginalized existence for the sake of an elusive revolution. However, and this is the second part of the story, she said, her years at Gold Flower Brigade were only part one. So she left Gold Flower Brigade in the 1980s in pursuit of a piece of the pie. And to her, that meant a career and a home of her own, and also a claim on America for civil rights as a sexual minority. She got a couple of college degrees, and then she became the head of the City of Olympia's housing program, through which she instituted affordable LGBTQ elder housing, and she led victorious fights for city ordinances against hate crimes and job discrimination and for domestic partnership recognition. Some other things that lesbian feminists accomplished. And I want to go back to Rita Mae Brown for a minute. Her autobiographical novel, Ruby Fruit Jungle, she began it while she was in the Furies. And I think it vies with that really morbid and depressing well of loneliness, which used to be the most famous lesbian novel ever written. I can remember reading it in the early 1970s, and I was a literature professor, so I didn't read it for its literary values, but I thought it was fabulous because for the first time there was a gorgeous, cheerful, and triumphant lesbian that we just had not seen in literature before. And when Brown first tried to publish her book, no mainstream press would take it, but a small lesbian feminist press in Vermont, a press called Daughters, published it. They sold 70,000 copies in 1973. That's huge for a small press. And then Bantam, a mainstream publisher, bought the rights and sold over 1 million copies. And then countless other lesbian writers profited by Brown's success. And I have to say that I certainly did. I was not part of the radical lesbian feminist movement, partly because I was too busy learning to be a professor and raising our son with Phyllis, my partner. But I realized in the 1970s that because of writers like Rita Mae Brown and because of the proliferation of these women's bookstores and lesbian literature, that there was an audience out there that might want to read what I had to say about lesbian history. And I had no trouble finding a mainstream publisher. They bid on the book because its time had come, and its time had come because there were all of these women's bookstores. And so in 1981, my first big lesbian book came out, and that was Surpassing the Love of Men. I also profited by lesbian feminism in general. I think lesbians of my generation did, because lesbian feminist rhetoric was the first that we'd heard that said that being a lesbian was something to be celebrated, that we didn't have to live in twilight or see ourselves as criminals or crazies. It was incredibly affirming in ways that we just could not have imagined in the 1950s and 60s. It was really revolutionary for those of us who did not see ourselves as radical lesbian feminists too. Another way in which radical lesbian feminism was important has to do with the way radicals have always advanced social justice movements. Radicals are just, they're so bold and so bad in their demands. They just want to overthrow the whole system. And so they made, in this case, moderate lesbian and feminist demands for decent treatment seem perfectly reasonable and rational. It was kind of like the good cop, bad cop phenomenon. And so I look back on them now. It's a half century after the birth of lesbian feminism, and then their dreams of lesbian nation that soon followed. And I really try hard to evaluate them clearly. They were certainly true believers with all of the problems inherent in true believerism, and they were certainly naive. And yet they responded to the position of woman in their times with just wonderful creativity, and they had some very positive impact. And so I'm bothered that if their history is mentioned at all, it's to vilify them as TERFs, as trans exclusionary radical feminists. I know that many of us have certainly come to understand transgender issues, especially in the 21st century, when we've had the benefit of really meaningful dialogue on the subject, but Lesbian Nation didn't have the benefit of that dialogue. And so as a historian, I want to regard those women of Lesbian Nation as an important slice of history and not judge them by our contemporary understanding. And so I'm just going to take one more minute to quote another woman that I interviewed who, like me, had never been a radical lesbian feminist, but she too really appreciated what that movement did for her and for all lesbians of her generation. And I'm going to end my presentation with her quote. She says, "I was not a participant in the lesbian feminist community, but I was eventually a grateful beneficiary, and I have to acknowledge a debt to women who spoke out for and to people like me, and reminded us that there is no reason to go on fearing ourselves because other people fear us out of ignorance. Would I even have come out without all their clamor? Hard to say, but I believe I owe a lot to those loud-mouthed, radical lesbian feminists. They refused to swallow all the crap about lesbians that I and most of us had been swallowing for years. And I'll end with that.
I think you can't hear me yet, no?
You
Oh,
can.
yes, maybe you can. Oh, sorry. I wasn't sure. Well, thank you, Lillian, for an amazing talk. And I'm sure that I know that I speak for many in the audience that we also need to really thank Phyllis for her cameo appearance in the beautiful song. There were calls, I have to say, in the chat for a standing ovation. So imagine a standing ovation on various screens. I think that it was a great line trashing the dining room, but I have to say the two of you brought down many houses across the continent. So we have time now for questions. Hopefully some are coming up in the chat. Other people, I'm sure, are pondering what you've said. And now people can just, in the Q&A on the bottom of your screen, if you hit that, I can then pass on your questions to Lillian. And I have one already. Do you think there's still a place for a lesbian nation in our future?
I don't think that appeals to the younger generation. I think that young people are much more flexible in terms of their identity. Many young people within the LGBTQ community see themselves as genderqueer. I think Lesbian Nation is a lovely part of our history, and I'm afraid I don't see it taking hold with the younger generation, with third or the fourth wave of feminism. I may be surprised, but so far I don't see it.
Yes, sometimes things in history stay there, right? There's just a lot of appreciative comments in the chat, so I hope we'll give that to you later, but I do have a couple more questions. Susan Bennett, who's an English professor here and a friend of mine at the University of Calgary, says, thank you for a wonderful, indeed inspiring talk. I wonder what lesbian feminists thought of the recent TV series, Mrs. America, especially, or what Lillian Faderman, your initials, sorry, not lesbian feminist, Lillian Faderman, thought about the recent TV series, Mrs. America, especially in its portrayal of lesbian representation.
Yes, I know Gloria Steinem hated it. I thought that it was a little light in its portrayal of lesbian feminist representation. I think it captured well enough Betty Friedan's homophobic attitude. So I like that part. I sort of didn't like it that the straight woman who was part of Phyllis Schlafly's group had to get so high to appreciate lesbian culture and wouldn't have done it if she hadn't taken LSD, I assume it is. That bothered me a bit.
An anonymous attendee asks, was there a large eco-feminist interest in the time period you discussed?
There was, because many of these women went back to the land, and of course they were interested in Mother Nature, as they kept saying, and in preserving the land. And I think they were pioneers in ecofeminism, yes.
Annie Yeomans asks, if you had to recommend one book to folks to begin learning about this, what would you recommend? And thanks you for her presentation. for your presentation.
Learning about lesbian history, well, I'm going to first immodestly recommend my book, Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers, which is a history of lesbian life in 20th century America. But there are some other really wonderful books. Liz Kennedy and Madeline Davis, for instance, did a terrific book called Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold, about a lesbian community in a bar community, a lesbian bar community in Buffalo, New York. And I think that was really a book that should be reprinted and is certainly worth reading again. And if you're interested in a larger gay history, there's my book, The Gay Revolution. There's also a very good book by Michael Bronsky called The Queer History of America. And there are many regional books, including Kevin's book, which I have not read yet, but I'm very anxious to read.
So that answers one of the other questions on my list, but another question. Thank you so much. Wonderfully informative. My impression is that in Canada, there was not the lesbian separation that you present so well. Can anyone comment on the Canadian scene? If not, Kevin and Carolyn Anderson might like to work on this.
I would love to hear comments from people in your audience who are in Canada, because I'm afraid I don't know very much about lesbian communities in Canada. I'm familiar with Body Politic that came out of Canada, but of course that wasn't a lesbian periodical.
Well, I will just say that anybody who has some information could put it in the chat, and then we have it a record that we can pass on to Lillian. Tanya Callahan, another colleague of mine at the University of Calgary, asked, she couldn't get on. She's using her partner's Strad message. Is there any evidence of lesbian feminists embracing trans women and making space for trans women in different spaces? I ask because there's little evidence that gay men made space for trans men.
You faded out a little bit, Annette.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is there any evidence of lesbian feminists embracing trans women? She says there hasn't been much evidence of gay men embracing trans men.
Yes, there was evidence of that, even at the Michigan Music Festival, which got a bad rap for being trans exclusionary, but that wasn't entirely the case. There was a lot of back and forth, a lot of controversy among the lesbian feminists at the Michigan Music Festival. And my understanding is that there were trans women who were allowed in the Michigan Music Festival because of these lesbian feminists who were sympathetic to trans women. So there's certainly evidence of that, even historically, even back in the 1980s and the 1990s.
So we did get a comment from Mary Valentich, who says there wasn't as big a lesbian separatist movement in Canada. We've gotten several requests for other recommendations for novels, lesbian novels. You mentioned Ruby Fruit Jungle. Are there others that you would like to mention?
Yes, if you're into science fiction, I think a real classic was Sally Gearhart's Wanderground, which I believe is coming back into print, a lesbian feminist novel. One of my favorite lesbian feminist writers was June Arnold, who wrote a very interesting experimental novel called The Cook and the Carpenter. There are wonderful historical novels, not particularly lesbian feminist, but lesbian and feminists, such as was written under the name Isabel Miller, not her real name. Her real name was Alma Rootsong, but the novel is Patience and Sarah, just a terrific historical lesbian novel. Naiad Press, and there were a number of publishers that sprang up in the 1970s and 1980s that specialized in lesbian literature of all sorts, Nayat in particular pioneered in lesbian mysteries and lesbian science fiction and lesbian romance and lesbian historical novels. So there was just no paucity of these terrific popular, not literary, but popular lesbian novels in the 70s and 80s. Catherine Forrest was very popular and wrote for Naiad Press and continued then to write even for mainstream publishers.
So I have a couple of a comment and a question from my colleague in the history department, Nancy Yanovicek, who works on the Back to the Landers. So her question will go in that direction. But I first want to pass on her information that Becky Ross's book, The House That Jill Built, talks about lesbian separatism in Toronto. So that's a useful book. She's asking, could you speak to lesbian potlucks, referring to a May 2019 article on, she's referring to a May 2019 article on how they have and continue to nourish the movement.
Yes, lesbian potlucks have a long history, beginning with Daughters of Bilitis, which started in San Francisco in 1950. It started as a social group to be an alternative to the very dangerous gay women's bars in the 1950s. For a little while, they tried to become political, but it was much less political than a potluck place. Women met regularly to talk about the business of the organization, but also to have potlucks. And I think they continue because they're obviously the symbolism that is women nurturing each other with food. And I think it's a main source of lesbian socializing, beginning at least in the 1950s, probably earlier than that too. I came on the scene in 56, so I can remember it from the 50s anyway.
We have an interesting question about superstitions. Do you know of any fun superstitions or conspiracy theories raised by conservatives during the era of lesbian nation? With women embracing witchcraft, etc., was there a fear surge?
I don't know specifically of attacks on lesbians for that, but of course, the radical right was constantly attacking lesbians and lesbian feminism and feminism, beginning particularly in the 80s. One point of attack was the ERA, that actually started in the 1970s. And I think that the radical right always thought of the ERA as a lesbian plot. I don't know of specific attacks on lesbians as witches, though, but just the idea of lesbianism and lesbian feminism was a favorite whipping girl of the radical right.
So another anonymous attendee asked, if you could hypothesize, how would you say the women of the lesbian movement of the past would respond to the idea of TERFs today? I ask because when a woman is called a TERF, it seems to be intended as an insult or a fault on her beliefs.
Yeah, it's difficult to extrapolate the thinking of lesbian nation of the 1970s to today. I imagine that many of those women still alive today would have been educated about transgender people, and I would imagine that many of them do not identify as trans exclusionary lesbian feminists, radical feminists. I know that there are certainly issues that are still very controversial today, like trans women in sports, and that has been a big controversy among radical feminists even to this day. But it's difficult to say how the women of 1970s would have felt about what's going on today.
Mm-hmm. First of all, another, this time a viewing recommendation from Linda Garber says the film Lesbiana is a film about lesbian culture in Canada in the 1970s and 80s, directed by Miriam Fougère in 2012. So that's for everyone's benefit. And another question, all lesbians have a right to our culture. A lesbian-only culture is essential, and to promote it worldwide is life-saving in so many parts of the world. All women have a right to say no to man without question. So that's another comment. And then this one leads to a question, I think. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I was so sad to hear at the end about the economic pressure that led many of these activists to leave their retreats. Do you know much about the role, if any, they have gone on to play in any of the anti-capitalist protests of the last decades, Occupy, etc.?
Yeah, I think that many women who were radicals in the 70s and 80s and 90s have certainly continued to have radical sentiments today. I don't know specifically what 1970s lesbian feminists are doing in movements like Occupy and other radical movements, but I don't think that all of those radical sentiments have been erased from those women who were lesbian feminists in the 70s.
I think I have one final question. They came fast and furious, so I might have missed some along the thread, but the last question I have here is, what was the significance of the aesthetic during this time? So the stylization of the cartoons and the posters that you shared, I wonder if you know something about that.
I think it was very much a do-it-yourself aesthetic. These women weren't professional artists for the most part, but I think they really believed that any woman can, like that wonderful cartoon that I shared with you. It wasn't professional, but it was very political and it made its political point.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I fear that I have lost a lot of good stuff that was in the chat thread, which is a different thread, but again, we'll pass that along to you. We are nearing the end of our time. Oh, I have one more here. I think we can just squeeze this one in. Or it's a comment, I think. Almost all lesbian bars have closed in the last decade. So does that matter?
You know, it certainly mattered to women of my generation that there be lesbian bars. That's how we met each other. Without the lesbian bar, we would have been lost. But my understanding is that the younger generation has the internet. They have meetups. They had things that were absolutely inconceivable to women of my generation. So I don't know if young women particularly miss the lesbian bar the way we would have missed it if it hadn't existed.
Well, I think it is now 8:30. We're very close. You're getting feedback from the background. And others are joining me to thank you for this wonderful evening. We would have very much have preferred to have you here in person for a nice dinner. And I know that I speak for Gemellis in that respect, that we do intend to live up to our promise to bring you to Calgary at some point. And I'll be very happy to drive you and Phyllis to Banff and to see the mountains and to have a social occasion. But I know that Noreen also wanted to say something.
On behalf of the CIH and UCalgary alumni and the Journal for the History of Sexuality, let me thank you all in the audience, of course, first for joining us this evening and for your enthusiastic engagement through the chat and the Q&A. And I'm sure you will all join me in expressing heartfelt thanks to our distinguished speaker, Professor Faderman, for the very important and inspiring history lesson she has just presented to us so learnedly, so lucidly, so generously, and indeed so musically. And thanks to Kevin Allen for contextualizing the talk on a local level, and Professor Annette Tim for her beautiful introduction and moderation. A recording of today's session will be posted to the Alumni Month website in the coming days. And please also visit the CIH website and subscribe to our mailing list if you have not done so already to find out more about upcoming CIH hosted events and how you can further support the Institute. So thank you once again to everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening and keep very safe and well.